Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing a special episode outside of the Culinary Bootcamp series, and today's episode I'm going to talk about how to properly read and follow a recipe. So let's get started. First of all, I've chosen a recipe today to use as an example, and I'm not saying that there's anything particularly wrong with this recipe, but I thought it would be a good example about what to do when you find a recipe online, because there are a lot of recipes online and they're not all peer-reviewed or tested. Sometimes even the people who are posting them haven't even tested them, at least based on using those recipes and them having questionable instructions or ingredients that just don't make sense. So I'm going to talk to you about this recipe today, and then we're going to make it. It is a sticky honey garlic shrimp recipe that I found at eatwell101.com. So before we get started on making the recipe, I'm going to give you some tips on how to follow recipes, how to prepare so that once you get started, you don't miss ingredients and you don't skip ingredients and you don't get started before you know if you have everything you need. There are a lot of different ways you can mess up following a recipe, specifically if you're finding them online. So with that in mind, let's go through my tips. First, when you find a recipe that you'd like to make sure that you read through it fully at least twice. And when you're reading through it, really think about what you're reading. Second, make sure that the techniques that are being used in the recipe is actually something that you can execute or are able to do reasonably with a little research. In addition, make sure you have the time to adequately prepare, cook, and serve the meal or the recipe that you intend to make. I guess this is like the fourth tip, is to note any preheating or pre-cooling instructions and look for any elements of the recipe that may need to be made ahead of time. Make sure that you take out ingredients that need to be at room temperature with plenty of time in advance. Please note that if it's an ingredient that is susceptible to spoiling or bacteria, that you should not keep it out on the counter for more than about an hour to an hour and a half. If you want to know about different bacterias and risks in the kitchen, please see my safety and sanitation video. The link is in the description. There's actually two of them, one that's dedicated entirely to bacteria and one that's more of an overall general safety and sanitation in the kitchen guide. And additionally, there might be an ingredient that has to thaw. If you're thawing an ingredient, that's going to take a lot more time, and you need to be careful if you're thawing it on the counter not to leave it out too long. And if you're thawing it in the fridge, you consider how long it's actually going to take to thaw that ingredient to the point where you can use it in a recipe. Make sure that you make notes about any instructions or ingredients that seem out of place or timed improperly. Now I've lost track of how many tips that I've given because I did not bullet point or number them. So this next tip, just make up a number. Make note of any ingredients in a recipe that requires dividing. For example, if a recipe calls for 2 cups of flour, but a quarter of that cup needs to be used in another stage in the recipe, make sure that you measure that out and leave it aside. I'm always a fan of making notes, or even taking a piece of paper and like labeling the ingredient on the counter that may need to be used in at a later time. Make sure you have all the equipment that the recipe requires. Now there are some examples of substitutions, and so if you don't have a particular appliance or a particular utensil or something that the recipe is calling for, you can always take a look online. There's usually some suggestions on substitutions. Here are a couple examples of equipment substitutions that you could do in the kitchen. If you don't have a potato ricer, you can use a box grater. If you don't have a meat tenderizer, you can use a hammer or a rolling pin. If you don't have a citrus reamer, you can always use a fork. And if you don't have a rolling pin, you can also use a wine bottle. Just because you can use a wine bottle to substitute a rolling pin and a rolling pin to substitute a tenderizer doesn't mean that you can use a wine bottle to substitute a tenderizer. Make note of the yield of the recipe, and the yield of the recipe is generally the quantity it creates or the servings it provides. Make sure to make adjustments as needed, and I would definitely write those adjustments down as you go along. You can always rewrite the entire recipe, replacing the quantities as needed in order to stay on track. And that's a great way to also keep that recipe for use at a later date if it turns out how you want it to turn out. Make sure you have all the ingredients. Sometimes you can substitute ingredients, and there's a lot of information out there on different food substitutions. I'll provide a link in the description of 1 or 2 very reliable sources for that information. Some ingredients can be replaced due to dietary concerns and that kind of thing, but you really want to be careful how you're replacing ingredients and what you're replacing them with. It's also important to identify any ingredients that may not jive with your nutritional program or your health needs. If you are altering ingredients for your recipe, it's important to remember that baking is way more of a science than cooking. In cooking, replacements are much more flexible and you are more easily able to tailor a recipe to your needs. When it comes to baking, it's very difficult because you can't just replace one type of flour for another type of flour, because there are different proteins in different flours, and that will have an impact on the final ingredient. If altering ingredients, make sure to remember cooking is more flexible and leaves room for personalization and improvisation, while baking is a sensitive and chemical reaction dependent activity. When it comes to flavor elements and adjusting them in recipes, say if you're going to double a recipe or something, there are some elements that you should not double because they will not have the same chemical reaction at different quantities. And an example of that is salt and spices and alcohol. For those, if you're doubling a recipe, it's best to multiply the quantity by 1.5 and then taste and adjust. But if you're reducing sugar, it's important to know the role of sugar, especially in baking. Sugar helps keep moisture and water inside. It locks in moisture during baking and prevents foods from going dry. Reducing sugar by too much can have a disastrous impact on your baked good. For example, in cooking, it can cause your cookies to be more domed than spread out. And that is an issue that I come across quite a bit when I'm trying to reduce the sugar in my baked goods, because I try to reduce sugar in my diet. But I usually end up with a cookie or something that's not exactly what I'm looking for. So be very careful when you're doing sugar replacements in recipes. Okay, so this is very important, and I think this is a step I know people who skip this, and I skip this once in a while, and it doesn't always turn out right. So if you're cooking or baking, always measure out and portion out all the ingredients before you start mixing things together. This will reduce missing an ingredient in the recipe that may or may not be very, very important. It also reduces mismeasuring mishaps. So that would be if something called for a cup and you, for some reason, put in 3/4 of a cup, it gives you that last extra barrier before you add it all together to realize that you may have made a mistake. I want to make sure that I reiterate what to do when doubling baking recipes. Doubling ingredients like baking soda and baking powder, which are leavening ingredients, may not be effective. Again, as I said, baking is a science. So if you're doubling a recipe, it's just best to make 2 batches of the same recipe. It will ensure a more consistent product and less chance of a failure. All right, so let's get started on this recipe. So the main issue with this recipe that I had when I read through it is I got to the directions and it wants me to start cooking the shrimp, and then while the shrimp is cooking, mix together all these ingredients. Now, shrimp cooks very, very fast. If you're a new cook, this is not a great way to prepare the dish. What you should do is mix all these ingredients together and make the sauce, and then start the shrimp. Now, I say this because shrimp cooks fast, and if you're not used to it, it's very easy to overcook shrimp. And because I'm not making this full recipe because I'm the only one eating it, but I think that halving this would probably be fine for me, and if there's a little extra sauce, I won't have a problem with that. So like I said, you want to go through and just do an adjustment on paper. All right. Now, as you can see, I've had to make some substitutions. I don't actually use soy sauce. I use this product instead, so I've changed that. I don't have a fresh lime, so I'll be using this as a replacement. And portioned. Now we're going to rinse and pat dry the shrimp. Now we'll take it all to the stove. Now that my recipe is getting all splattered on and stuff, let's take a look at the next step. So it says rinse and pat dry, shrimp dry, season with salt and pepper. You can thread the shrimps on a toothpick for better handling. Grill or pan fry shrimp, medium heat till the shrimp are cooked thoroughly, approximately 5 to 10 minutes, flipping as needed. What am I supposed to fry the shrimp in over medium heat? You will notice that this recipe does not indicate an amount of fat to use or to use fat at all. So that's going to be a very important thing to remember. And if you don't know how to follow recipes and it doesn't say that, that's a little bit concerning. I'm going to use avocado oil, and this is going to be a personal preference for you. Alternatively, this would be really good with coconut oil or any number of good quality oils. And if you haven't checked out the episode I did on the best oils to use and how to choose your oils, take a look in the description for the link. I've been told it's quite helpful. I'm just gonna eyeball it. Alternatively, you could mix this with a little butter also, so you can have a couple different oils mixed if that's kind of your thing. I'm gonna go simple with just avocado oil today. So you let that come up to temperature, and once that gets warm, we'll be right back. Now, the recipe did say to salt and pepper your shrimp, and how much you want to use is completely up to you and can be dictated by your dietary needs. One way to tell if fat is ready is you can put a little bit of a carbohydrate in there and see what happens, and you can see it starting to bubble up, and that means it's at a good temperature. But you will want to monitor it, maybe turn it down, and so then we'll put in the shrimps. I'm taking you away from there real quick because while that's cooking, we're going to put all of the other ingredients in a saucepan and bring it up to boil. Now, the recipe does say that once those ingredients are all mixed together, to put a little in with the shrimp before you start boiling the whole mixture, and so that's what we're going to do. Hopefully we don't overcook the shrimp. So as you can see, that shrimp cooked really fast, and if I was putting together all the ingredients I needed while that cooked, they would have definitely overcooked. Some of them are a little overcooked. So yeah, I was gonna give you an example of what overcooked and cooked looks like, but I know that I have a little illustration, so I'm just gonna show you that. The difference between an overcooked and a normally cooked shrimp, and this is what they're supposed to look like. So as you can see, they look a little overcooked, but they're gonna be fine. And it's just for me. And because I didn't have any green onions, I opted to have them on a little bit of chopped up romaine. So what you wanna do is just transfer them over And then it says just drizzle some of the, of course, good plating practices. Take preferably a damp cloth and you just wipe around the edges where you don't want there to be any sauce. That should be good. And again, because I didn't have any green onions, but I did want to garnish it, I'm just going to sprinkle a little crushed red pepper on top. So there you have sticky honey garlic shrimp. Let's take a taste. All right. Let's give this a taste, hey? Now, it's got honey in it. I don't usually eat sweeteners. This was an exception. So I'm probably just going to love it because it's got real sugar in it. I mean, it's good. It's spicy. Would I recommend that recipe? I would have made changes to it. But that's one of the reasons I did this video. Is because just because you find a recipe online, and even when you have a culinary education, you can still just make something that's not that great. So anyway, I'm gonna go finish what is my lunch. Thank you for watching my video today. I hope it helped you learn a little bit about things to consider when you're following a recipe. I hope you learned at least one thing. If you learned anything, please leave me a message in the description. If you didn't learn anything, you thought this wasn't a great video, you can also tell me that. I'm okay with criticism. Again, thank you for watching my video. And as always, have a wonderful day.